Good evening, Real Life Church. Welcome once again to our Wednesday night midweek service where we have real conversations that are raw, authentic, based on real things that are happening in our life. We trust that last week you tuned in and that you got something out of this conversation that we've been having around parenting, and particularly parenting adolescents and what their spiritual formation looks like in that phase of life. I know that we've been enjoying this conversation, and we have our guest, Rowan, back with us again today, and we've also got the parents and Jeremy back with us again, and we're just going to get straight into it tonight. And I want to start off, Rowan, by basically quoting this stat that I think you know very well, which says that 60 to 80% of young people or young adults are leaving the Christian faith. What are your observations? What are your thoughts behind that statistic?
Yes. All right. Straight into it. Let's go. Yeah. So, okay, a little bit of history. So it was around about 10 years ago that different research groups in America, the UK, and Europe began to observe something that they began to call the Exodus. That young people seem to be leaving the church. And while there's always been an element where adults have kind of lamented that young people aren't coming through and the aging of the church and so on, there seemed to be an uptick in this going on. And so researchers began to look into it. And while different methodologies produced different results, the general gist was, roughly speaking, more than half of young people that have been raised in the church or significantly identified in faith before their 18th birthday, about half of them will be gone into their mid-20s, by their mid-20s. And depending on the denomination, it gets worse and worse and worse. And so, for example, there was a study in Canada that went, if you were evangelical Protestant, you were about 50% would go. If you were what they call mainline, which so kind of uniting Lutheran, it would be more like 80%, and if you're a Catholic, 90%. Like, it's really kind of frightening. They called their report the ever so complimentary hemorrhaging faith. Very visual image. And it doesn't seem to have changed. Doesn't seem to have abated. The statistics have come on and on and on to seem to indicate that across there's different markers where there seems to be significant points of change, but broadly speaking, across the mid-adolescent and into the young adult age range, there's a really strong period of renegotiating faith. Now, when we looked into it, it used to get called losing faith, right? And the image behind that was that young people in the church had faith, and people then outside the church didn't have faith. They lost their faith. And I understand that language, and it makes sense to kind of intuitively use, but it's also a little bit clumsy in a sense, because in some sense, if faith is the mechanism by which we make sense of God, then that mechanism of making sense is always with us. So what we're having faith in is changing. And so before we had faith in Christ in the church, but then we may have lost our faith in Christ, but we transplanted that faith into something else. Yeah. And that might just be Western democratic capitalism or the Richmond Footy Club or but it's something that gave you identity, meaning, belonging, and significance. Yeah. Okay. But so it's a faith change that happened. It may have taken you out of the church, but you didn't lose faith per se. Another thing about that, if you like, while we're on it, is that we can also split it into two, which is some people lost faith in the church, disengaged with church. Some people lost faith in Christ and disidentified with Christianity. And those two aren't the same thing. So you had some people that were disengaging with church, still identifying with Christ. You had some people that were disidentifying with Christian faith, but still engaged in the church. And so the kinds of faith changes going on were not all the same, right? And so some people, we can think of parents like, my kid just doesn't want to go to church. You cue into their faith identity, they're still okay with Christ, but the church thing's just not a thing, And so, the Christian community thing we can work on, but their identification's going strong. They're just disengaging from church. So what kind of faith change is happening is so as I said, a pretty large phenomenon we spotted about a decade ago, and that has been growing and strengthening in our understanding. And as with all things, the more you look at it, the more you start to pull it apart and see its kind of details. And these are some of the things we've begun to observe.
Do you think, and I know that you mentioned these studies were done in Canada, I'm assuming in the US as well to some degree. Given that Australia, we've got a different history, religious background, do you think we see similar statistics in Australia?
Yeah. So, you know, a part of my PhD, no recommendation to read it. It's a long and arduous piece of work. But one of the first things I set out to do was to go, look, here are the studies in the UK, Europe and Australia, in the US. Is there equivalent studies in Australia? There's no specifically equivalent study where you can go point for point. The National Church Life Survey have been doing an extraordinary piece of work, and as this phenomenon became more aware, the National Church Life Survey then began to adjust and add some questions to their processes. So they started asking questions like, were you still attending 10 years ago? Are you still attending now? As parents, were your kids still attending here? Are they still attending that? So they're all approximate, but they're all ways of starting to get at the movement that's happening long term. And the NCLS has been around for years, so they're able to track things. And like my hat is off to them. Since 1987, they have been saying to the church, something's wrong with the young people. You're not seeing, you're not noticing. All right. They released a report called Generations, I think, or 40 years of missing generations, where they just started tracking what they call the age demographic profile of the church, and just watching the middle shrink and shrink and shrink and shrink as less and less and less teens and young adults, meanwhile more and more oldies as it was happening. And so you got what we wound up calling an hourglass demographic profile. You got lots of kids, some teens, no young adults, the parents of the kids, and then their grandparents, and that middle part's gone. And our demographic profile, the Australian population, doesn't look like that. So the church has got a problem, all right? And it's something about that inability to kind of grow young. In fact, one way of reading the stats was there's an era, and in certain denominations, we were better at evangelism than we were at discipling our young people. We were having 10% evangelism growth and losing half of our young people at the same time, and the net result was a shrinking church. Wow. All right, because we're losing more people than so there's something about the fact that we cottoned on to processes and ways of doing church that became evangelistically attractive, but were poor discipleship environments for young people.
So as a previous youth and young adults pastor, and as a current youth pastor right here, frightening statistics. Not so upbeat. How does that translate to the effectiveness of youth ministry? And I can only probably talk about from our context. I guess we come from the ACC movement, and it's not about the movement; it's about just in general, right? How does that translate to the effectiveness of how we've been doing youth and young adults? And I don't know whether you want to add to that.
Do you want to
basically, I think, how do we, as a youth ministry, knowing those statistics, and obviously what's happening in the modern church, for example, how do we better, as a youth ministry, disciple that age group to continue on that legacy of just growth and maintaining that through to adulthood? Is there something, maybe like a quick tip, or I guess it's deeper than that, but is there something that you can maybe kind of expand on how to better do that? And also, just to add to that, how can we better structure maybe like a program, for example, or better form relationships with young people to be the goal of being disciples and actually impart that culture into their lives?
Wow. They're great questions, and in a sense they're, like the heart and beat of almost any ministry is wanting to grow young people up into the very nature and stature of Christ kind of thing. It's the main game. And so when you hear stats like this, it's kind of like, oh man, what's going on? What are we doing? And for a while there, because the phenomenon seemed to be so strong in the young adults, the first kind of finger pointing went to youth ministry unfairly, I think. It's kind of like, the narrative was, if they weren't proper Christians in youth ministry, then we just inherited the mess as young adults.
It's always the youth ministry's fault, by the way. Everything's
well, and then the youth ministers just went, it's not our fault. They're stuffing up in children's ministry. We're getting, just
goes down the line,
Yeah. So we learned a lot from Eve, from Adam. Just pass it on. Yeah, it's this person you gave me. Anyway, all right. So there are lots of ways to tackle this. This is the way that encountering these statistics really is what kind of launched both the PhD and my engagement with young adults to kind of go, what is actually going on here? And as I mentioned before, one of the first changes that I had to make in my thinking was it's not about losing faith, it's about changing faith. This is about change. And people are losing faith in Christianity and the church and changing their faith across. And for a while there, I wanted to be faultily the person that could stop that change happening or insulate people from that kind of faith. And while that's still present in me, in that sense of wanting people to grow into their full stature in Christ, I had to change my thinking away from this idea of lost faith, or of no faith and having faith, but thinking, right, we're in the world of faith and it's changing. And so I really, over time, my pathway into seeking to address this in the people that I was ministering to was to become a student of change. How does any kind of change happen? Therefore, how can we grow constructive change that increases faith in Christ, as opposed to, because the idea of if it's just about having faith and then changing and losing faith, then you try and stop all change and you keep people still, right? Or you're trying to bring them back. Whether if you understand this as being a changing time and developing time, we want then change to grow into the life of faith and to actively participate in that process. So one of the simple models, or a model that helped me to kind of go, oh, that's really helpful, was a guy who first wrote this in 1976, like when everybody had long hair and beards and the hippie movement was in full swing and all the rest of it. There's this guy called Westerhoff, and I really like him because there was some real geeky nerd out people that were doing this faith development stuff, and they produced theories that I still can't understand. But Westerhoff came up with this way of mining all of that information, then pulling together a model that I could understand. And he just had this, the way he described it was, you can think about a fully mature faith having 4 aspects to it. It should have an element of experience, and by experience, it's kind of, if you can imagine that as kind of like an arrow from God to the young person, that there's an experiential reality that is for the person, and that's happening for them personally, right? And this is something that seems to happen. I reckon there's something like this that seems to be evident in this idea of kind of a childlike faith. Like this intuitive, wide open to the world. Kids, when they tell you about their prayer life or these images of God they have, and you're just like, as an adult, that hasn't happened for me I lost something along the way. That wide open wonder to the experiential reality of God. Like the God image is just so ingrained within them. There's something about that. And it's not necessarily about holding that wider idealism, but you can sort of see that in a child, and for that to grow up into an adult receptive experience of God is one piece of it. The second piece of it then is more of a social dimension, all right? That faith actually has a human-to-human interaction, that we participate in the presence and reality of God through others, through community, through receiving their ministry, by being together, enjoying the process of belonging. Belonging in a community helps us to experience the belonging of God. All right. So to the degree that we have a social acceptance and a reality and a social environment which helps us to interpret the experiences that we have of God. There's this weird thing that happened in my prayer life. What was that? Oh, that's happened to me before. Let me tell you about that. All right. I was reading this thing in Scripture and I didn't quite understand that. Oh, that process of socially reinforcing and interpreting what's happening in the experience life. All right. Then there's 2 pieces of the puzzle, and you'll notice that both of those are kind of like outside in, from God to the young person, from the community to the young person, right? So we can call them outside in processes, but there's also inside out things going on, right? And one of those, and this is the first challenge, one of the many challenging areas where I had to rethink my theology, was I now call it the red zone of faith. And that in almost every faith development theory I've ever found, there's always this experience of faith that gets called searching, critical, doubting, questioning, unpacking, pick your adverb kind of thing. It's an ing word, so it's it's one of those ing words anyway. But it's an unraveling kind of process, which I just sort of scooped up and called the red zone. And what's interesting is that every faith development theory I've ever met, every paradigm that talks about how faith grows, everyone has it. Everyone has it. Yes, there's an experience. Yes, there's a social element. Yes, there's the land of milk and honey, but there's the wilderness. There's the hard times, there's where it doesn't make sense. But what's interesting about when these come into faith development theories, every one of them says this is not anti-faith. This is not the absence of faith. This is not the problem. This is actually the engine room of faith. This process of seeking to make meaning and figuring out and searching through and is actually the engine room. And on the other side of that is the fourth element, which Westhoff calls an integrating kind of faith. And an integrating kind of faith is where anybody, and a young person in particular, has now internalized the outside-in stuff, right? The experiences of God and the social interpretation of that has been searched and critically assessed and tested, and it's now integrated and it becomes part of their inside-out movement of expressing faith. And so a young person is now able to say, because I know, because I believe, therefore, and that because is there because it's gone through the red zone, it's gone through the wilderness. Now I mention all of that to say that when I first came across this theory and others, and came across these statistics which spoke of all these young people losing faith, the first thing this development theory said was, they're not losing faith, and this is not the thing that you want to save them from. This is the red zone. This is the wilderness period, and which is not to say it's all lovely and clover and all the rest of it, all right? This is a decision point. This can be turning of the road, but it's not the absence of faith. It's the very process by which experienced realities and social realities get tested and refined and get integrated. And so if we want our young people to own their faith and integrate it and internalize it so that they can then express it, learning how to minister in the red zone is actually key.
Yeah.
Not only minister in, but maybe even provoke, maybe, right? It's up for debate, right? But ritualize and authenticate, all right? So there's a place for it to be expressed within the context of gathering together in church and so on. Maybe even liturgy or prayers or ways that people can say, yep, what's going on in me just got set up there, absolutely. It's not always okay. Those kinds of elements then become part of our become part of the question then of what does it mean for us to stand against the storm, to hold back the exodus, to stem the flow of the hemorrhage. I think part of the secret is learning how to minister to, parent through, be friends through and mentor through the red zone, not as the thing that we want to save our kids from, but as a necessary journey that takes them to the other side. It's a rite of passage. It's an initiation.
Wow, that's awesome. I think that's great. I was involved in youth ministry for 20 years, and yes to that. It's like, I think the majority of ministering you do to young people is in the red zone. Definitely. Most of our ministry is in the red zone, right?
But sometimes you don't always see it. Yeah. Like what a terrible word. We were talking last week about how sometimes we create communities that aren't quite as welcoming, and we can talk about how you put on your Sunday best and you put on your church smile and you arrive in here and foyer conversations, they're loud, lots of people around, it's hard to go deep and go real, and so you say, yeah, I'm fine, I'm great, things are kind of going okay. And for people who aren't going great, their experience of that is, well, everybody else is fine, but I'm not. Or this isolating kind of feel. And so it is absolutely that the teenage and young adult years, it's all about the red zone. And part of the knack of ministry is fostering environments in which a young person can go, yeah, actually, it's not okay. It's not okay. Can I tell you a story where this became real for me?
Yeah.
So in early years of being in ministry, again, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and inexperienced, I was working at a church which had a different kind of formation pathway. They did a thing called confirmation. And so many of the young people were baptized very young, often as infants in this, but the process of owning their faith was then ritualized instead of in adult baptism with adult confirmation. And so 15, 16, 17, somewhere in that era, these young people would be participating in confirmation process. Now, I was not ordained in the church, so I was the youth worker, not a youth pastor or minister, and it was the pastor's job to confirm. And so, and I was working with, we had 2 interns at the time, and so we're kind of furiously doing a youth ministry thing, but confirmation belonged to the pastors. And he was awesome. He was a tremendous firecracker of a pastor, and he was tremendous with the young people. And at the same time, we were also becoming aware that it was like there were so many ticks in this program of good things, that they were getting kids to memorize scripture and learning great theology and reading text and learning how to interpret it, and they were coming together every other week to kind of do this stuff and engaged in service project and connected in a mentoring relationship, like lots of great stuff going on. And at the same time, we were noticing that for some people, this sense of confirming the faith that was in there, like getting the inside out, wasn't happening. They were able to parrot it off. They were able to kind of get through, but not kind of get there. And so a bit of a conversation happened amongst myself and the interns to kind of go, do we provoke this? Like, we're seeing it happen. And what is the downside of confirming them? Because like the thing that I became most concerned about was that if a person gets through that program, and I'm not judging them. It seemed that they were parroting. I'm not saying they were, but if let's say they were parroting and they get to the end of it, and then we as the church say, "That's it, you've got it, that's the faith." They're like, "Well, why hang around? You know, confirmation becomes graduation. I'm done. This is not real." So anyway, one night the pastor couldn't be there, and there's me and the interns, and we're like, "The cat's away." Like, what are we going to do? And it wasn't exactly like that, but we wanted to do something different. And so, the normal program would have been to, study this and do this and practice some memorization and so on. And we flicked it. And we went right the way to a person's soul is through their stomach. And so we got pizzas, and we sat down on the floor, and there was about 15 people there, and we needed more of a plan than this. Like we didn't have much more than we're going pizzas. We're going to sit in the circle and we're going to have some real conversation. And we probably should have planned it a bit more than that, because the pizzas started disappearing rapidly, and all of a sudden that part where we're meant to having a deep conversation is coming, and we don't know what we're going to do. Anyway, the male intern, bless his soul, in a moment of desperation, sort of nudges an empty pizza box into the room. No, a box that still had some pizza in it, kind of mixed pizza. And his question to the group was, if your faith was a pizza, what kind of pizza would it be? Exactly. We like the 3 of us, the interns and youth pastor, kind of looked at each other and went, "Where's this going?" And you could see that the young people had this face on, and like their foreheads screwing up, and the look on their face was, I wonder what is the right kind of pizza faith to have. No. Which is the natural response, right? I know the answer is Jesus, but it sure sounds like you're talking about a koala or something. And so anyway, this girl goes, and God bless her, she goes with, I'm feeling okay in my faith. Like, I'm not saying I'm Mother Teresa, so it's definitely not a super supreme. I'm going to say a capricciosa. All right? Seems to be going okay. Definitely room for improvement. We're like, oh, yeah, fair enough. You can see people going, oh, yeah, that's all right. And then, another person said something equally profound. But then there was another girl, and I still remember her courage. She had the different kind of furrowed brow. She had the furrowed brow that, in retrospect, I probably didn't know it at the time, but in retrospect, it was saying to the room, do I say this? Do I go there? And she goes, okay, so I'm going to say, I think my faith is a Hawaiian pizza. Now, at this point, the room erupts into protest, howls of protest, because the previous conversation of the last 10 minutes was all about how pineapple has no rightful place on a pizza. I think the word abomination unto the Lord was used at this particular point. Now, this girl who was a protagonist of this no pineapple on pizza thing says her faith is a Hawaiian. And she goes, yeah, that's my point, all right? There's stuff in here that I don't think should be here, and I know is not okay, but it's there. And then, like, bang, the room's different. All right? God bless the courage of that girl, right?
Yeah.
At that point, a guy kicks a pizza box, empty pizza box, across the room and goes, well, that's my faith. Used to, you can still smell that there was something good there, but now it's just empty, right?
Wow.
And now we're into a different kind of conversation. Yeah, it got on. It got real quick, and that was the point for us where we really went, okay, we've got to understand this better, and we've got to do ministry better, because it took us a while to get to this, and we unfortunately had a culture where a girl's got to screw up her face and go, am I really going to do this? Yeah. But once they crack the ice, then they're under and away. And yeah, that has just stuck with me as kind of a moment of going, right, there's working out how to access the red zone with people then becomes key. So
what are the things, I was going to, instead of calling it the red zone, what are the pineapple pieces that we're finding that young people are dealing with? So when we talk about the red zone, what are those issues in the red zone that are causing them to change their faith?
Can I just ask,
please,
and put a little part B to that question? Is it because of the world we live in these days? Now, it wouldn't apply to things going back 20 years, but maybe in the last 10 years. Is it the pineapple? Is part of the reason people are leaving is the pieces of pineapple, where they're going, I got pineapple on my pizza. I know it shouldn't be there. I don't know what to do. I don't feel like I should be going to church. So Maurizio's question with a little bit of extra.
Thank you. That there, something that this research is pointing to, which is part of the uncomfortable truth, maybe, of the insight, is that as a church and as youth ministers, we do need to come to a reckoning with the fact that not all of the pineapple is coming from the world out there. All right, now we might overstretch the pineapple metaphor, so we might need to change our language here. But when you talk to young people that have disengaged with church or disidentified with Christian faith, a lot of the time they cite dynamics within their experience of the Christian church as part of their difficulties and struggles. Okay, so one piece of research, for example, which came from the Barna Institute, they wrote a book called You Lost Me, where they went out and actively researched people on the way out, and so on, and asked there's challenges to their research, but there's some blindingly great insights. And these people said that here's the top 6. They experienced the church as being overprotective. All right, so bringing in the boundaries, really prescribing behaviour and saying, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. And while we might say, well, there was rightful and safe measures about, and we were rightly pointing out that, they're dumb ideas and so on, can you hear that kind of agency, that locus of control? You kept saying I couldn't do it. You're being overprotective. I needed a different kind of ministry that could help me to see the truth of what you were saying without just saying, don't do that, don't do that. Overprotective. All right. Shallow. We became good communicators and had pithy little sayings, but we didn't have substance underneath it. I've got kind of complex questions that you can't narrow down to a little 5-word one-liner that is really snappy. All right, something a bit more complex. Bit more of the American scene possibly, but anti-science. All right, the whole science is wrong, faith is good, and you had young people going, I want to integrate these things a little bit more. Actually, science is what turns our light bulbs on. Science gave us the iPhone. Science is what's driving this video production that we're behind. We're using it, so we can't say it's all wrong. If people are getting to the moon and back, then there's something to it as well. Repressive, so there's something around sexuality that young people are telling the church to go, we want to have a different kind of conversation. The just don't do it kind of thing is not cutting it. Maybe there's more to the story that the Christian community has to say about intimacy and about solid relationships and so on, apart from just don't do it, just don't do it. Exclusive, we're right and everybody else is wrong. Doesn't cut it in an age of spin. Right? Everybody thinks they're right. All right. Why did 9/11 happen? Because 2 religions said our God's right and started fighting the other one. Just doesn't make sense to young people anymore. And then finally, providing no legitimate place for doubt. Right? They experienced their communities as being places that they couldn't ask their questions, so they had to ask their questions outside of their communities, and so they found answers outside of their communities. Right? Now, it may not be an exhaustive list, but it's enough of a one to kind of go, there's some interesting words back to the church to say there's some dynamics here around power, around control, around not coming alongside young people when the red zone's happening and trying to control the red zone or save people from it or something. That means we're not quite handling it well. So certainly, like, the flip side of those questions is we can talk about, the secularization of kind of the worldview, pluralization, and. Like, there's lots of stuff going on there, different, morality and ethics of the broader culture compared to Christian culture. So those classics are all there. But what's interesting, I think, is that the comments that's coming back from young people is those things have always been there. What I need is help with these things, and your move to be overprotective or anti-science or hasn't helped me to navigate those particular dynamics.
I'm gonna ask you a tough one. That this was a conversation that Evelyn and I were having.
Now I get a tough one.
You're gonna get a tough one now.
The other one,
How? So, in light of some of these, whatever we want to call them, these issues, hot button issues, where young people are saying, "I'm leaving the church because of the way that you see this." When you marry that alongside with government legislation that's now coming out about the way that we are, as a church, are to talk about certain issues, or more specifically, are not to talk about certain issues. How do you see the role of the church navigating those issues and addressing those issues in a way that we are still hold on to our convictions, biblical convictions, and show grace at the same time, but also a relevant, speaking to a relevant culture in a relevant way? How do you see that happening in the church? I know it's a big question.
Yeah, thanks.
Especially for those that are going from that teen to those young adult years, where now they're kind of getting those bigger responsibilities, and maybe there's relationships that are in the future or things like that. They're I suppose their world is widening, will be widening now with all these new, college or all these new worlds for them. It's going to get wider, so there's going to be more coming at them.
Wow. Yeah, okay. So whether it's a hot button issue or not, in many cases I think the dynamic can be the same, which is to say, the process of integrating and internalizing faith is through the red zone, and through the red zone is a testing and a sifting environment, and where that can't be done for them by another. Okay, so before faith grows in the early stages, where that is done for them, adults interpreting experience on behalf of the other, adults telling them what God is like, adults exhibiting what God is like to them, outside in, right? But that internalizing move is grappling with that in a particular way, and then from the inside out expressing the reality. Now that grappling move, there's a change in the authority situation, okay? And the outside in move of telling what is, at some point, it has a use by date. But there are a million other moves that you can do, all right? So non-judgmental presence, curiosity, and critically engaging their ideas from a place of respecting their ideas starts to then tease out what's going on, okay? So again, there's going to be a million more ethical dilemmas that we haven't even imagined yet coming their way. So what you want to be growing is a competence in the young person for them to be able to go, because I believe, therefore I choose, and I don't know what to believe on this one, but because I know how to research and study and seek the heart of God, and I know how to then integrate and live that out, because I can do those movements, that's the kind of competence that you want to develop. So to the degree that we remain with a you should, this is what is true, only believe and everything's okay, we're kind of holding them to a model of faith development, which is just remember what I told you and everything will be fine. Which, if I can say it sort of overly harshly, it's asking them to have a faith in the faith of others. Right?
Wow.
I believe because you believe it. As long as it works for you, then everything is okay. If I see it not working in you, then it draws it into question in me. But I've got nothing because I haven't internalized it yet. Right? So if you really want them to internalize it, and this is what, like, you got to hear me feeling. You might think that I'm sounding really comfortable about this idea. Like, this is really challenging. You know, with my kids and with others, this process of I can't control the outcome here, and I shouldn't. All right. If I really want someone to own their own faith, they have to have a capacity to own anything. They have to develop the competence and the capacity to critically engage and be able to go, because I believe, therefore, and because I don't know what to believe here, I can go and research and then integrate. And that's the capacity that you're looking for. And so that is one where non-judgmental presence, curiosity, and critically engaging with respect the ideas that they're generating and testing them and prodding them with them. Like when you join them in the red zone, then they can say stuff and you can critically engage with it. Just as they're critically engaging with you, it's a tennis match. You're allowed to do that. As soon as you step out of that and go, you can't believe that, because you move back out of the red zone and you went with a should. All right? If you said, really? I don't know if that adds up, because what do you make of this particular verse? How are you interpreting this? What do you think is the outcome of? You know, they're questions that come from a place of sort of equal respect, to say, I respect your capacity to figure this out. Give me your best shot, you know, and I'll see how it comes. All right. And I think the difficult part for us is, if they come through that process seeing differently to you, just don't blow the belonging bit. Don't say, therefore we can't be. All right. That's that ruptures your capacity to be a part of their wrestling into the future. All right. If you want to still be a part of it, hold the belonging, even if you can't if you can't hold the belief and behaving, hold the belonging. All right. Because then you'll still be a part of the believing and behaving in the long term.
That's good. It's good. Those 4 areas that you talked about, do you see them as, you know, I guess one of those areas would change in terms of the focus of those areas as a young person's faith is maturing? So, for example, at this level of my faith, I need more nurturing, or at this level of my faith, I need more, whatever it is, belonging, or one of the other areas.
That's a wonderful question. The way Westerhoff originally envisaged this was concentric circles like rings on a tree. So smaller, bigger, bigger, bigger. And his idea there was that the earliest experience we have as faith as kids is raw experience. Right? It's just the world comes into us, God comes into us, and then we kind of regurgitate that back out. And so that's the first movement, to which we add then the social belonging and the social interpreting of that experience. So the next bit comes on, and now you've got both happening, and you get this interplay between both. All right. So then the red zone, when that comes along, that's a sort of a tricky one, because it feels like it ruptures the other. But again, when you can start to function as a faith community that honors the red zone, legitimizes it. It's a real part of faith, not the and enables it to be kind of ritualized and, I'm going to say, blessed. Now there's 3 things that a young person can do as their faith: experience God, be engaged in the social reality, and critically engage with their faith. To then a 4th, which is integration. Now, what tends to happen then is that it feels like they switch on. All right, so childhood, late childhood, early teens into the social thing. All right, 7, 8, and 9. There's critical faculty going on, but it's the social game which is big. right? Whether a person's world through 7, 8, 9 and 10 is going well is almost entirely dependent on how their social world is going, all right? You know, their friendships break up and God doesn't exist. Like it's that quick kind of thing. So the red zone really kicks in from mid-teens and into the young adults, all right? But it's not that they live there, it's that they've now got that as well. All right. Now it dominates their perspective, but helping them to see outside of the red zone that they are connected, that they do have belonging, that they are still experiencing God. I'll tell you a story about that in a tick. All right. To then get to the integration. So they switch on progressively, like all good development does. We slowly switch on our capacities, but then once they're all there, then you've got all 4 of them, and then at different points in your life, you'll feel the pressure and stress on them. Now Westerhoff does say that you can spend the majority of your life in experience and social. Right, which we call the blue and green zone. All right, that you can have kind of an experiential relationship with God, or an experience that's totally derived out of your experience of the community. All right, that you kind of believe because these people believe, and as long as the community holds, your belief system holds, and as long as the pastor keeps interpreting in a way that you agree, then it all kind of works. You can. It's quite a strong socialized faith that's called, and you can stay there your whole life. All right, and communities often you find really emphasize those 2 zones. And if you think about the kind of ministries that we do, and youth ministries and church services, they really hover around those 2 zones. You think like, what ministry practice would I plan and implement in a church that's the red zone? It's harder to think of those. We don't sort of regularly go there, all right? We don't have lament services we have celebration services, we have Thanksgiving services. We arrive and we say, isn't it great to be in the presence of the Lord? And some people are like, hell no. Actually, it's not. I feel the presence of the Lord makes me feel crap, actually, or something like it's really kind of difficult. Or as another person said to me the other day, I do rock up to church and I listen to people sing because most of the time I need people to sing the words for me. Right? Oh, wow. Now it's a great moment of community, got the green zone going, all right, but they're in red, all right, and they would love some people, to have that red zone kind of authenticated. I've forgotten the original question, but the question is, these things become added. Now, when young people become able to recognize, I'm in the red zone. I'm not losing faith. I'm just in the red zone, right? So we're interpreting their experience. Yeah, you got questions. Oh, it feels like I'm falling apart. It's not falling apart. You're in the red zone. Oh, that's right. I'm in the red zone. Okay, wilderness. Got it. All right. I know how to do the wilderness now. Right? The people of God figured out how to do the wilderness, kind of. Mucked up a little bit, all right? Jesus showed us how to do it a lot better. All right, with these 40 days. And we as stewards and mentors, angels tended to Jesus in the wilderness. If we can be angels tending to our young people in the wilderness, that would be a tremendous blessing for them. One thing I want to say, just riffing on the wilderness thing, this thought occurred to me the other day. The people of God in the period of the Exodus went into the wilderness, and that was a crucible. So a crucible is a holding environment where transformation takes place, and then you break the like a chrysalis, all right, and you break the crucible when you emerge as a butterfly or something. So the wilderness was a crucible for the people of God. The task being to kind of get Egypt out of the Israelites to prepare them to enable them to be able to inhabit the promised land. Now, what was the dominant move of the people of God in the wilderness? What did they always complain and want to do?
Go back.
Go back, all right? And what did Moses and Joshua continue to say to them? We've got to go on to the promised land, all right? Now, think about a young person. When they go into the red zone, so often we as a church, we say, come back. All right, come back to the way we were. Come back to this way of engaging with God. Come back to this way of engaging with Scripture. Come back to that old way, all right? And I wonder if we've got it wrong, actually, that if we were to do the Moses move, we'd actually say, yeah, God is bigger. There's always more, all right? In fact, there's a dear friend of mine in the States who's a Catholic sister, and she has mentored and spiritually directed young people forever. And in fact, that's her line. She's like, when people come to them and say, oh, sister, it's all falling apart. Like, she smiles at them, and she has this tremendously warm sort of maternal kind of presence with them. And she says, I see you're ready for more, child. And you can just see them go, this just extraordinary change comes across them to go, all right, it's not that I'm losing what I had, it's actually I'm being readied for more. And it's challenging. It doesn't always feel like that's the case, but certainly I can underscore that young people, when they do go into the red zone and they feel this kind of draw back to something that feels too small, they'll militate against that. All right, there's a forward movement in development that you want to be able to participate with, and we keep coming back to these things: non-judgmental presence, curiosity, find the why that's going on here, and see where this goes. Critically engage with them as respected equals, and we'll see where this goes.
Wow, that's great. Well, this conversation has been very, very challenging, to say the least, for me as a parent, not of a teenager yet, getting my mind thinking in that space. I think that for all of our listeners, all of our church, it will be a stretching, get our minds thinking. If there's one last thing that you could leave us with, that you could leave our parents with, our parents on the stage, when it comes to our young people and the journey that they're on towards following Jesus, what would that be?
I've probably said this word too many times, but maybe if I say it this way. As a parent, I'm tempted when I feel challenged by my kids' choices. As an adult mentor to young people, when I see things that I'm becoming uncomfortable with or something like that, I first of all need to recognise that I'm becoming uncomfortable with it and that I might be speaking out of my discomfort. And when I speak out of my discomfort, I might be inclined to challenge or to confront. But my first move is not to be curious. And I think if I was to believe in tattoos, and if it was possible to tattoo something on the inside of my eye, it would be curiosity. That, when I speak out of my own discomfort with what's happening, I'm going to challenge or I'm going to confront, but I don't know why it's going on. I don't actually know what's going on. All that's going on is I'm uncomfortable with it, and I want to speak that uncomfortable and put that upon them. And if I can pause for a moment and go, I don't know why this is happening. Can I be curious? Hold the belonging. We are okay. You and me, we're okay. The belonging's not in question here. You don't have to worry about that. That gives you the right to ask the next question, which is what's going on here. And if you're deemed trustworthy, which is by being a non-judgmental presence, you might get an answer. The red zone feels terrible as a young person. Like, the experience of being in the red zone is isolating. Nobody understands me. No one else is going through this. Everybody else is okay. My world's falling apart. And now you're going to come down and say that I'm grounded and. Like, the experience of being in the red zone is not fun. The experience of being in the wilderness is not a great place. We need to be angels tending to people in the wilderness, and sometimes a little bit like Moses, calling them forward to say, it's okay, your God got too small, it's okay, he's bigger. There is infinitely more for you to explore. Let's go find this together.
Awesome. Great. Thank you so much once again, Rowan. Thank you guys for being with us. We hope that you got so much out of tonight. As I said once before, please check out our YouTube and Facebook channels, and you can find all of this content on there and share it with someone who perhaps needs to listen to this conversation. Church, we'll see you next time. God bless you.